Imagine touching a burning stove and your nervous system, instead of triggering that automatic reflex to pull your hand away, it suddenly floods your brain with this chemical cocktail.
Right.
And it convinces you that the fire is actually this warm, protective blanket.
Yeah.
So you just keep your hand there.
Yeah.
You literally watch the damage happen to you, feel the agony underneath it all, but your brain is just screaming at you that pulling away would mean freezing to death.
Exactly. And, if someone on the outside tries to pull you away from that stove, you might actually fight them.
Wow.
You defend the fire. Because we like to believe our biology will always steer us away from harm, right? But when the mammalian attachment system is systematically hijacked, well, the nervous system becomes conditioned to associate terror and unpredictability and volatility with love.
And with survival.
And with survival. That's the scariest part.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today we are opening up a massive, incredibly complex stack of sources. We've got clinical psychology literature on trauma recovery, forensic family law methodologies, behavioral science research on coercive control.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It really is. And we are looking squarely at covert narcissism, post-separation abuse, and really the intricate neuroscience of toxic relationships. Because our mission today isn't just to list out red flags or recite textbook definitions.
Right, because if you're listening to this, you probably already know what gaslighting is.
Exactly. You know what love bombing looks like on the surface. But we are here to uncover the hidden truths about human behavior, the invisible emotional needs, and those unconscious psychological mechanisms driving these dynamics.
And the clinical literature makes one thing abundantly clear here. Until you understand the invisible biological chains that keep a person trapped in a high-conflict relationship, well, the behavior of the victim makes absolutely zero sense to the outside world.
It just looks baffling.
Totally baffling. Society looks at this intelligent, capable person staying with an abusive partner and asks, why don't they just leave?
The classic question.
Right, but that question fundamentally misunderstands the neurological reality of the situation. It makes this tragic assumption that the victim's internal compass is still intact.
Which it isn't.
Not at all.
So let's start exactly there. Before we can talk about the aftermath, the smear campaigns, navigating family court, how to heal, we have to understand the trap itself.
The neurobiology of the trauma bond.
Right. Because we all know the term love bombing by now, I think. The grand gestures, the intense eye contact, the feeling that you've just met your absolute soulmate.
Right.
But the sources show this isn't just romantic manipulation. It's actually a systemic neurological setup.
It is. I mean, the initial phase of a toxic relationship literally floods the targeted partner's brain with dopamine and oxytocin. It is intoxicating.
Like a drug.
Very much like a drug. And it establishes this profound baseline of trust and dependency. But the critical shift happens when the mask slips and the devaluation begins.
The subtle undermining, the verbal abuse.
Exactly, the silent treatments. But the abuser doesn't just stay cruel, that's the key. They weave moments of warmth and apology back into the chaos.
And this is where the trauma bond is forged.
Right, through an unconscious psychological mechanism known as intermittent reinforcement.
So, okay, the classic comparison here is a slot machine, right? But I've always found that analogy a bit lacking, to be honest.
How so?
Well, a slot machine doesn't emotionally abuse you, it just takes your quarters. Like if a machine took my money every single time I pulled the lever, I'd just walk away.
Right, but the slot machine analogy does hold up when you look at the neurochemistry. You just have to add a darker psychological layer to it.
Okay, walk me through that.
So imagine a slot machine that not only takes your money, but actually manages to convince you that the reason you are losing is because you aren't pulling the lever correctly. Right. During the devaluation phase, the victim's HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is just fully activated. Their system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline.
So they're in pure survival mode.
Chronic hypervigilant survival. And the threat is in their own home. But then, suddenly the abuser apologizes. They show a flash of that original love-bombing warmth.
And the slot machine pays out.
Exactly. But look at what happens biologically in that exact fraction of a second. The sudden drop in life-threatening cortisol, combined with this massive, unexpected surge of dopamine and oxytocin from the abuser's sudden affection, it creates a neurochemical relief so intense that the brain misinterprets it as profound love.
That is terrifying.
It is. The victim's nervous system literally stops distinguishing between the source of the danger and the source of the safety.
So the abuser becomes the only available psychological remedy for the pain that they themselves inflicted.
Precisely. The cycle fundamentally rewires the brain's reward circuitry. This is why talk therapy alone often fails victims of trauma bonds. You cannot simply logic your way out of a physiological addiction.
Which perfectly explains a concept in our research from the psychologist Jennifer Freyd. She calls it betrayal blindness.
Yes, a brilliant concept.
When I first read about this, it honestly blew my mind. The idea is that intelligent, hyper-competent people stay in these relationships not out of weakness, but because their psyche actively, subconsciously suppresses awareness of the betrayal.
Right, and Freud's research points to an evolutionary survival mechanism. Think of the human infant.
Okay.
If an infant's primary caregiver is frightening or abusive, the infant can't just run away. They can't survive on their own.
Right, they're trapped.
So acknowledging that the caregiver is dangerous would subconsciously mean acknowledging certain death. So the infant's brain develops this evolutionary workaround. It turns a blind eye to the abuse to maintain the necessary attachment.
So it literally blocks it out.
Exactly. And adults in trauma bonds regress to this primal survival state. The brain concludes that seeing the full truth of the betrayal would destroy the attachment, and losing the attachment feels synonymous with death.
So they engage in extreme cognitive dissonance. And they're holding two completely contradictory truths at the same time. Like, this person is my soulmate, and this person is systematically destroying me.
Right, and the human mind cannot tolerate that level of friction.
So the victim just takes the blame.
They do. They tell themselves, if I just communicate better, if I'm just more patient, things will go back to how they were in the beginning. They absorb the fault to preserve the illusion of control.
They sacrifice their own reality to keep the relationship intact.
Yeah. But eventually the cognitive dissonance becomes just too heavy to carry. The betrayal blindness lifts.
And this is where the narrative usually ends in the movies, right? The victim packs their bags, they walk out the door, and the healing begins. Roll credits.
If only.
Right. But our clinical sources say the exact opposite. Leaving isn't the end of the story. It is the match hitting the powder keg.
It really is. The dissolution of the relationship is a massive flashpoint. When the targeted partner finally breaks the bond and leaves, the dynamic doesn't terminate. It metastasizes.
Because the separation destroys the abuser's control.
Exactly. Which triggers what clinicians call a profound narcissistic injury.
Okay, a narcissistic injury. So we're not just talking about a bruised ego here. We are talking about a total psychological collapse of their false self.
Right. A person with high conflict, narcissistic, or psychopathic traits, they rely on an absolute illusion of superiority, perfection, and control. And they need this to mask a core that is actually fragile, empty, and drowning in shame.
So they don't actually possess a stable internal sense of self-worth.
No, they outsource it entirely. So when a partner leaves, it doesn't just hurt their feelings, it shatters their entire psychological architecture.
Wow.
The hidden emotional need driving the narcissist post-breakup is this desperate requirement to defend against those destabilizing, annihilating feelings of shame.
So to survive that, they have to externalize all accountability.
They cannot simply grieve the relationship like a healthy person. They must destroy the departing partner to reclaim their perceived superiority.
Walk me through how this actually plays out behind closed doors, because one of the most insidious tactics in the literature we reviewed is reactive abuse.
Yes.
How does an abuser orchestrate this to convince the world that the victim is actually the problem?
Let's look at a really granular scenario. It's, say, a Tuesday evening. The victim is exhausted, trying to manage the household, maybe already operating on a totally frayed nervous system.
Right.
The narcissistic partner begins a campaign of covert baiting. Now, it's not necessarily screaming. It's often this relentless, calm, systematic needling.
Just poking and poking.
Exactly. They might mock the victim's parenting or casually bring up a profound insecurity or rewrite a shared memory just to make the victim sound crazy. And this goes on for 2, 3, 4 hours.
And the abuser stays calm.
Utterly calm. Almost amused.
So they are actively hunting for a trigger.
They are pushing the victim's physiological buttons until the victim's prefrontal cortex just goes offline and the amygdala completely takes over. Finally, backed into a psychological corner, the victim snaps.
They yell or throw a dish in the sink or just collapse weeping.
Right. Or they say something incredibly harsh.
And in that exact second, the abuser pulls out their phone and hits record.
Or they calmly call the police. Or they wait until the next day to show the texts to a custody evaluator. They capture the victim's explosive reaction, the breakdown, and present it to the world as objective proof that the victim is unstable, vindictive, or abusive.
It's like they're perfectly directing a movie where they cast themselves as the stoic hero dealing with this completely unhinged partner.
Yes.
And what's really tragic is that society falls for it completely.
They do. The legal system, law enforcement, even well-meaning therapists often mischaracterize this as mutual conflict or just bad breakup drama.
They see a frantic victim and a calm abuser and just assume equal blame.
They entirely miss the unilateral, hidden pattern of coercive control that actually led to the eruption.
Which feeds directly into this concept of DARVO. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender.
Right.
The abuser denies the hours of provocation, attacks the victim's reaction, and reverses the role so completely that the person who is emotionally tortured actually ends up apologizing for raising their voice.
DARVO is literally a psychological meat grinder. It dismantles the victim's reality testing over time, leaving them questioning their own sanity. But, the abuser doesn't just run the script in private.
Because to stabilize their fractured ego, they need an audience.
They need a large audience to validate their false narrative.
The smear campaign. Clinical psychologist Dr. Ramani Durvasula refers to this as large-scale gaslighting. The abuser realizes they can no longer control the victim directly, so they pivot to controlling how the rest of the world perceives the victim.
Right. The smear campaign is preemptive, deliberate character assassination. And the hidden psychological mechanism here serves a few distinct purposes. First, it preemptively discredits the target.
So if the victim tries to speak out later, nobody believes them.
Exactly. The abuser has already poisoned the well, making the victim look like a bitter, lying ex. Second, it protects the abuser's flawless public mask. And third, it intentionally isolates the victim from their support networks, leaving them totally vulnerable, alone, and without resources.
I really want to dig into how they build this army, because the literature refers to these recruits as flying monkeys.
Borrowing from the Wizard of Oz.
Right, the Wicked Witch of the West, setting her monkeys to do her dirty work. This is proxy abuse. The abuser keeps their hands completely clean, while third parties harass or spy on the victim.
And the sources categorize these proxies into three types. You have the innocent messenger, the willing accomplice, and the professional enabler.
Okay, I struggle to buy the innocent messenger idea, honestly. Like, if someone has been my friend for a decade and my ex comes to them with wild accusations, shouldn't they know me well enough to see I'm not the monster being described? How do smart, well-meaning friends fall for this so easily?
Because the narcissist is a master of the performance of victimhood. They don't usually go to your friends acting angry or vindictive.
They go with tears in their eyes.
Exactly. They present a heartbreaking, highly convincing story of how worried they are about your mental health or how cruelly they were abandoned after trying so hard to save you. They prey on the empathy of good people.
It triggers a protective instinct.
Right. So your social circle gets activated. The innocent messenger then reaches out to you thinking they are mediating or helping, but they are actually delivering guilt-inducing messages, crossing your boundaries, and reporting your reactions back to the abuser.
It is the ultimate weaponization of empathy. They use the best parts of human nature against the victim.
Yes.
So what about the willing accomplice?
The willing accomplice is driven by different motives entirely. They actively join the harassment, often because they're deeply enmeshed with the abuser. They might want to gain favor or secure proximity to the abuser's power or money.
Or just avoid becoming the next target themselves.
Precisely. They recognize the cruelty, but their own self-interest overrides their morality.
And then there's the professional enabler, which, according to the clinical guides we read, is the most devastating.
By far, because the professional enabler institutionalizes the harm. These are custody evaluators, mediators, parenting coordinators, sometimes even couples therapists who fail to recognize high conflict dynamics.
Right.
The narcissist walks into a professional's office, dressed well, speaks calmly, and uses therapy speak terms like boundaries, gaslighting, and narcissism to describe the actual victim.
They steal the vocabulary of recovery.
And the professional, who is often trained in collaborative conflict resolution but not in coercive control or domestic abuse, validates the abuser's distorted narrative.
So while the abuser is basically burning your reputation to the ground publicly, sending flying monkeys, and charming custody evaluators, our sources point out this really bizarre paradox. Privately, they're often trying to suck the victim back in.
The hoovering phase, named after the vacuum cleaner.
Right.
While they're destroying you publicly, privately they're attempting to suck you right back into the cycle.
What does a hoover actually look like? Because I imagine it's a bit more sophisticated than just a late-night I miss you text.
It's highly manipulative and it spans a wide spectrum. On the subtle end, it might be a seemingly accidental text message, sending a nostalgic photo, or reaching out on the anniversary of a parent's death.
Oh, that's dark.
It is. It can escalate into grand romantic gestures, fake remorse where they suddenly take accountability for things they denied for years, or future faking where they laid out detailed plans for the life you always wanted together. And on the really dark, coercive end of the spectrum, hoovering involves feigning severe medical emergencies or threatening self-harm just to force the victim to break no contact.
It kind of mirrors the love bombing phase, but the clinical rationale is entirely different, isn't it?
Completely different. Love bombing happens at the start of a relationship to build trust and initiate dependency. Hoovering happens post-separation, and it's driven by an intense, deep-seated fear of abandonment and a fragile ego that is starving for narcissistic supply.
So it's not about missing the person. It's about missing the control. They just want to know the switch on the wall still turns on the light.
That is the perfect way to frame it. And the extreme danger for the victim is that hoovering exploits the established trauma bond we discussed earlier.
Right, the intermittent reinforcement.
Yes. The victim's cognitive dissonance flares up again. They read that apology text and think, maybe they really have had a breakthrough. Maybe the person I first met is back.
What happens in the victim's brain when that text comes through?
A massive dopamine spike. The nervous system remembers the intermittent reinforcement. It craves the relief. And this is why the clinical recommendation is absolute unwavering disengagement.
No contact.
Exactly. Because the deeper lesson for the targeted partner is that any engagement with a hoover, even a furious reply saying, "never contact me again," is a victory for the abuser.
Because even negative attention is still attention. It proves they still have the power to dysregulate your nervous system.
It signals that the boundary is permeable. It provides them with the exact narcissistic supply they are demanding. You really have to recognize that these gestures are not moments of genuine clarity. They are predictable, calculated attempts to reestablish the cycle of abuse.
But let's be intensely practical for a moment. What if you can't just block them? What if you share a business? Or, far more commonly, what if you share children? You are legally forced by the state to communicate with this person. How do you protect your mind when every single email or text is a psychological landmine?
This requires a massive behavioral shift. The victim must transition completely from emotional communication to highly structured, forensic communication. The absolute golden rule in dealing with a high-conflict personality is never JADE.
JDE. Justify, argue, defend, explain.
Right.
But explaining my side and defending my reality is how healthy humans resolve conflict. It feels incredibly unnatural to just let a false accusation sit there unanswered.
It goes against every instinct of a decent person who values fairness. But you have to understand the hidden mechanism of JDA.
Okay.
When you justify your boundaries or explain your decisions to a narcissist, you are inadvertently validating their perceived authority to review, audit, and critique your choices.
You're handing them the bullets for their own gun.
Exactly. If they accuse you of being a lazy parent and you write a 3-paragraph email detailing everything you did for the kids that day, you haven't cleared your name. You've just given them immense emotional supply, and you've handed them a literal roadmap to your current insecurities.
So how do you communicate without JDing?
You deploy tactical communication methods. The most widely recognized is the gray rock method. The goal of gray rock is to become as emotionally flat, brief, and uninteresting as a literal rock.
Just giving nothing.
Starving the narcissist of emotional supply, you give one-word answers, you show no joy, no anger, no fear, no engagement whatsoever.
You essentially play dead.
Yes, but our clinical sources provide a really critical warning about gray rock. It frequently triggers an extinction burst.
An extinction burst.
Right. When a toddler realizes a tantrum isn't getting them a toy, they scream louder before they finally give up. When an abuser realizes their usual manipulative tactics aren't extracting a reaction, their behavior will often escalate dramatically to force a response.
So you have to be prepared for the abuse to get worse before they finally seek supply elsewhere.
Exactly.
And there's a massive legal risk with gray rock too, isn't there? Like if you act like a flat, uncommunicative rock in front of a judge or a custody evaluator, it can completely backfire on you.
Absolutely. In high visibility settings like family court, acting like a gray rock can be catastrophic. A judge or an evaluator might interpret your flat affect and refusal to engage as being cold, hostile, or uncooperative.
They label you as the difficult parent.
Right.
So gray rock works for passing them in the school parking lot. but it's dangerous in a legal setting.
Right.
What is the alternative?
The alternative is the yellow rock method. Yellow rock is basically the foundation of gray rock, but it's wrapped in a thin, bulletproof layer of conventional, superficial social politeness.
Okay.
You still offer zero personal information. You still refuse to defend yourself against bait, but you add a hello or have a good weekend.
It's the customer service voice.
Precisely. It demonstrates exceptional emotional regulation and cooperation to any third-party professionals watching without feeding the abuser any actual emotional data.
And for written communication, the literature really highlights the BIFF method, created by Bill Eddy at the High Conflict Institute.
Yeah.
BIF stands for brief, informative, friendly, and firm. Let's look at a concrete example. Say the narcissistic X sends a furious multi-paragraph text at 10 p.m. They accuse the victim of being a terrible parent because the kid stayed up too late, they threaten to call a lawyer, and they throw in a really low insult about the victim's new partner.
Classic bait.
Right. A normal person would write an essay defending themselves. What does a BIF response look like?
A BIFF response strips away all emotion, all defense, and ignores the bait entirely. It would simply read, "The kids enjoyed playing outside before pickup today. I will see you at the usual time on Sunday for the exchange."
That is brilliant. It's brief, it's informative, it's friendly enough to look great to a judge, and incredibly firm. It completely ignores the threats and the insults.
And critically, it generates a clean, professional, and easily digestible written evidence log for judicial review. Because these communication strategies aren't just about protecting your peace. They become a matter of absolute legal survival when the narcissist drags the victim into family court.
Let's pivot to the family court system then. Because reading through these forensic family law methodologies, it becomes glaringly obvious that for a narcissist, custody litigation has nothing to do with raising a child.
Custody is treated as a zero-sum game. The child is utilized as a weapon, a limitless source of narcissistic supply, and the ultimate mechanism for ongoing post-separation abuse.
Right.
The narcissistic litigant will frequently use litigation abuse, filing endless, frivolous motions, dragging out discovery, refusing to settle, just to financially and psychologically bankrupt the protective parent.
Hold on, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the systemic traps here. I read about the friendly parent doctrine in our sources.
Yes, a major hurdle.
If I, as a protective parent, set rigid boundaries to keep my child safe from psychological abuse, the court might look at me, say I'm not being a friendly co-parent, and actually punish me with less custody. That feels completely backward.
It is one of the most devastating systemic failures in family law. Family courts are generally set up to adjudicate disputes between two healthy parents who simply disagree on logistics. They look for compromise.
But you cannot compromise with a personality disorder.
Exactly. When an abuser launches a smear campaign in court, they often deport accusations of parental alienation.
So this is Darvo inside a courtroom.
It is. The abuser will claim that the protective parent is intentionally poisoning the children against them. In reality, the children are pulling away naturally because of the abuser's own frightening, erratic behavior.
But because the protective parent is visibly stressed, exhausted, and demanding rigid boundaries, they look hostile.
Right. And the narcissistic parent, who feels completely comfortable lying under oath and charming the evaluator, looks like the reasonable victim. The friendly parent doctrine inadvertently punishes the victim for trying to protect the child.
If shouting the truth makes you look crazy and defending yourself falls into the JD trap, how does a protective parent survive this? What actually wins in court?
A clean, boring, meticulously papered trail always beats a loud, emotional accusation. Judges do not diagnose personality disorders from the bench. You cannot go into court and say, "My ex is a narcissist."
You have to demonstrate patterns of conduct.
Exactly.
And this requires abandoning the entire mainstream concept of co-parenting, right?
Absolutely. Traditional collaborative co-parenting requires flexibility, fluid communication, mutual respect, shared goals. With a coercive controller, flexibility is just an invitation for boundary violations. Giving them an inch allows them to take a mile and blame you for it.
Right.
The clinical and legal solution is parallel parenting.
What does parallel parenting actually look like in practice? Because it sounds incredibly isolating.
It is a highly structured framework designed to eliminate all points of friction. There is no joint decision-making where a deadlock can occur. Areas of authority are strictly divided, transitions happen at highly specific neutral public locations, or better yet, through school drop-offs and pickups so the parents never even lay eyes on each other. And there is zero informal flexibility. If the court order says 5:00 p.m., you do not agree to 5:30 p.m.
And the communication.
All communication is forced onto unalterable court-approved applications like our Family Wizard or Talking Parents. These apps timestamp every message, they monitor tone, they track whether a message has been opened, and crucially, the records cannot be deleted or manipulated.
So it removes the abuser's ability to gaslight regarding what was said.
Yes. And if the abuser violates a court order, the protective parent must file a motion to show cause.
It doesn't constantly filing motions make the protective parent look litigious and high conflict to the judge?
It is a really delicate balance.
Right.
The first violation might look like a misunderstanding to a judge, but the second, third, and fourth build an undeniable, documented pattern of a parent who believes the rules of the court do not apply to them.
I see.
If you do not strictly enforce the boundaries, ignoring an order simply teaches the abuser that the boundaries are fake.
This sounds like a full-time job. You essentially have to become your own paralegal, regulating your own nervous system while acting as a human shield for your kids.
It is exhausting.
Which brings us to the most agonizing part of this deep dive. The children. How on earth can a victim protect their kids when they are legally forced by the state to send them into the abusive parent's house alone?
It is a living nightmare for the protective parent. Children trapped in these dynamics face severe psychological risks. They face parentification, where they are forced to become the emotional caretaker for the narcissistic parent. They face triangulation, where they are used as messengers, spies, or pawns to hurt the other parent.
The literature also mentions the risk of the child developing egoism. What exactly is an egoist?
An egoist is essentially the inverse of a narcissist. It's a child who learns to be chronically compliant. They become extreme people pleasers who are terrified of taking up space, asking for needs, or having an ego at all. They are taught through psychological conditioning that their only value and their only path to safety lies in managing the volatility and endless needs of the narcissistic parent.
It is just heartbreaking to watch your child be manipulated and flattened like that. But our sources highlight a massive psychological paradox here. Children of abusive parents don't usually reject the abuser. They often show a fierce, survival-driven loyalty to them, even defending the abuser against the healthy parent. Why does that happen?
Because a child is biologically wired to attach to their caregivers for survival. It is an existential imperative. If a parent is frightening, erratic, or cruel, the child's developing brain cannot comprehend that the parent is fundamentally flawed.
Because realizing your sole provider is dangerous means your survival is in jeopardy.
Right. So the child internalizes the blame. They decide, I must be bad, I must have provoked this, to preserve the necessary illusion that the parent is inherently good and will eventually protect them.
So if the protective parent sees this happening and tries to intervene by telling the child the truth, like your dad is manipulating you or your mom is abusive, what happens?
It backfires catastrophically. Forcing a child to see the abuser's pathology before they are developmentally and emotionally ready induces severe cognitive dissonance.
Their psyche just can't handle it.
No. To protect their fragile, necessary attachment to the abusive parent, the child will actually pull away from the protective parent. They will align with the abuser to reduce that internal friction.
That is just deeply unfair. The protective parent is doubly punished. They have to endure the abuse and then watch their child side with the abuser. How do you navigate that? What are the actual clinical protocols for talking to the kids about the other parent's behavior?
First, you must never badmouth the other parent. Never use adult diagnostic terms like narcissist, gaslighting, or toxic with a child. It places them in a crushing loyalty bind.
Okay.
Second, and this is crucial, you must avoid secondary gaslighting.
Walk me through what secondary gaslighting looks like in this specific context.
Imagine your child comes home crying because the narcissistic parent ignored them all weekend or raged at them over a spilled drink. The protective parent's natural empathetic instinct might be to soften the blow.
Right, to comfort them.
They might say, oh, honey, your dad loves you so much. He didn't mean it. He's just stressed at work. Or your mom is just having a hard time. She's not mad at you. While well-intentioned, this is incredibly damaging.
Because it tells the child that their perception of reality is wrong.
Exactly. That they weren't just hurt and terrified. It teaches them to excuse abuse and ignore their own internal alarm system.
Instead of validating their pain, you're unwittingly conditioning them for future abusive relationships. So what is the alternative? What should you actually say?
You validate the child's feeling entirely without attacking the other parent. You say, I hear that you felt really ignored this weekend, and I can see how much that hurts. Your feelings make complete sense.
Validate first.
Always. And then you deploy what clinicians call the 30,000-foot technique.
I found this concept fascinating in the notes. How does zooming out help the child?
It normalizes the behavior by attributing it to the broader struggles of all adults, rather than demonizing the specific parent. If the child is distressed by the ex's rage, you zoom out to 30,000 feet and say, dealing with intense anger is exhausting. Sometimes adults are not very good at managing their big emotions.
It's really hard to be on the receiving end of that, but it is absolutely not your fault.
Exactly. That is so powerful. It removes the burden of guilt from the child. It gives them a framework to understand the chaotic behavior, but it completely avoids forcing them into a loyalty conflict.
But even with all these tools, the BIF method, the parallel parenting, the 30,000-foot technique, it has to be absolutely terrifying to send your kid into that environment.
It is a unique kind of agony, but the developmental psychology research offers a profound beacon of hope here.
I'm glad there's some hope.
Studies on resilience show that the single strongest buffer against all of these psychological harms, the parentification, the trauma, the egoism, is the sustained presence of one stable, emotionally attuned, healthy parent.
That's one.
You do not need two perfect parents to raise a healthy child. One solid anchor, one safe harbor where the child's reality is consistently validated, can inoculate the child against the pathology of the other parent.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most vital section of our deep dive. Somatic restoration.
Yes.
Because to be that stable anchor for your child, to be the safe harbor, you have to heal yourself. And the trauma recovery guides are very clear on this. Intellectual insight into the abuse, knowing all the terms, understanding Darvo and hoovering, is not enough to heal the trauma bond. You can read every book on narcissism and still have panic attacks when your phone buzzes.
Because the trauma is not stored in the rational thinking part of the brain. You cannot logic your way out of it. The trauma is stored in the subcortical structures, the primitive mammalian survival brain, the amygdala. As Dr. Bessel van der Kolk famously established, the body keeps the score. The years of intermittent reinforcement have conditioned the victim's nervous system to associate terror with attachment.
And the unconscious psychological mechanism here is tragic. To survive the relationship, the victim had to destroy their own internal compass.
Yes. Carl Rogers, the pioneering psychologist, called it the organismic valuing process. It's our innate biological capacity to evaluate experiences based on our own sensory and emotional feedback. It's our gut feeling.
And the abuse just shreds that.
Prolonged exposure to gaslighting and coercive control systematically destroys this process. The victim is forced to suppress their own perceptions. They learn that trusting their gut leads to punishment, rage, and abandonment.
So how do you rebuild a compass that has been smashed to pieces? How do you heal the body?
Through somatic, body-oriented therapies, modalities that bypass the prefrontal cortex and speak directly to the nervous system. The gold standard for this is EMDR.
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Exactly.
How does moving your eyes heal a trauma bond?
EMDR uses bilateral stimulation-guided eye movements, tapping, or audio tones alternating between the left and right sides of the body, while the client focuses on a traumatic memory. This bilateral stimulation mimics the brain activity that occurs during REM sleep.
Interesting.
It helps the brain process the frozen, raw trauma, physically moving it from the amygdala's active alarm center into long-term memory storage. It decouples the present-day physiological urge for attachment from the past networks of terror and threat. It literally brings the prefrontal cortex back online.
That is basically rewiring the brain back to health. And the sources provide some incredibly practical, immediate somatic tools too, especially for high-stress events like walking into family court or doing a custody exchange. Therapist Annie Wright outlines a brilliant protocol for this.
Yes, her 10-minute pre-interaction protocol is designed to manually override the trauma response. Before walking into a courtroom or mediation, the victim doesn't just review their notes, they actively regulate their nervous system.
How so?
They orient to the physical space, naming 5 neutral objects in the room to anchor the brain in the present moment, signaling that they are not back in the abusive home. They practice slow, diaphragmatic breathing to stimulate the vagus nerve, which acts as a brake on the cortisol flood. They consciously unclench their jaw, drop their shoulders, and feel their feet on the floor.
And she includes cognitive role priming. Mentally stating to yourself, I am here today as a steady protective parent. My only job is to answer the specific question asked, not to defend my entire history in this moment.
It creates a psychological shield, and equally critical is the post-interaction decompression bridge.
Right.
Immediately after the stressful encounter, the victim must complete the physical stress cycle. Animals do this naturally in the wild. After escaping a predator, a gazelle will physically shake for a few minutes to discharge the adrenaline before returning to grazing.
But humans just trap that energy.
We often trap it. Completing the cycle might mean literally shaking out your hands in the bathroom, walking rapidly around the block, or splashing ice water on your face. This prevents the physiological stress from becoming lodged in the body and causing an emotional or autoimmune collapse later.
If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, there's a much deeper lesson here about where this vulnerability came from in the first place. You mentioned earlier that intelligent, strong people fall into these traps. But why do they stay long enough for the trauma bond to form?
This is where we touch on the roots of intergenerational trauma and childhood conditioning. Often the fawn response, that ingrained compulsion to people please, appease, and manage someone else's volatile emotions to secure safety, was installed long before the narcissist came along.
It was installed in childhood.
The victim may have grown up in a family system where love was highly conditional, and physical or emotional safety depended entirely on predicting and managing a parent's emotional state.
So the narcissist didn't break the victim. They simply exploited a break that was already there. The chaos of the abuser felt like home to a nervous system that only learned how to attach amid uncertainty and fear.
Precisely. The abuser just picked up the script the victim was already carrying, and realizing that is where true permanent healing begins.
Wow.
The profound shame that victims carry dissolves when they realize their responses were not failures of character. They were biologically programmed survival mechanisms, acting exactly as they were trained to act.
Let's synthesize this massive journey. We have traveled from the invisible, neurochemical traps of intermittent reinforcement and betrayal blindness. We've navigated the brutal, calculated battlegrounds of post-separation abuse, Darvo, and smear campaigns.
We've covered a lot.
We've unpacked how to shield the mind using forensic communication, Grey Rock, the BIFF method. We explored the zero-sum warfare of family court, the necessity of parallel parenting, and how to use the 30,000-foot technique to inoculate the children against the madness. And finally, we've looked at the biological necessity of somatic restoration, recleansing that lost internal compass through EMDR and nervous system regulation.
It is a profound, grueling trajectory from complete subjugation and cognitive dissonance to absolute autonomy and reality.
To you, the listener, if any of this resonated with your own life, if you saw your own relationship reflected in the slot machine or the reactive abuse, please hear this clearly. Your attachment to someone who harmed you was never a sign of weakness. It was not stupidity. It was a biologically predictable survival response to an impossible, crazy-making psychological environment. Your nervous system was doing exactly what it was designed to do to keep you alive.
And the simple fact that you are listening to this, that you are seeking to understand the mechanics of the abuse, means the betrayal blindness has lifted. The healing process has already begun.
I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over. We talked about how these vulnerabilities are often installed in childhood. But the research of neuroscientist Rachel Yehuda on epigenetics reveals something even more staggering. Her studies on trauma survivors demonstrate that extreme stress can actually be transmitted biologically, altering gene expression across generations.
It means the echoes of abuse, the heightened cortisol baselines go deeper than memory or learned behavior. They reside in our very DNA.
Which means the work of healing from a toxic relationship, the grueling, exhausting work of rewiring your nervous system, going to court, learning the BIFF method, and acting as a safe harbor for your children, isn't just about saving yourself today.
No, it's not.
By breaking the trauma bond, by refusing to pass on the chaos and the egoism to the next generation, you are literally altering the biological legacy of your family line. You are breaking a chain of trauma that may have been running for centuries.
You are replacing a legacy of terror with a legacy of safety.
We started this deep dive by talking about that burning stove, how biology makes a healthy person pull their hand away, but the trauma bond rewires you to hold your hand to the fire, convinced the fire is the only thing keeping you warm in the dark. But the absolute beauty of neuroplasticity, of somatic healing, and of finally understanding these hidden truths is that you can rewire yourself again. You can learn to trust your pain, you can pull your hand back, and eventually you can learn to build your own fire.